This was the first scene in Shadow of the Colossus that I ever saw. Way back in 2005, thanks to an IGN review by Chris Roper that I watched on the local library's computer, having heard nothing about the game whatsoever. I didn't pay attention to the video until this ominous scene, after which I immediately closed the video and began a longing to play this mysterious game on a console I didn't own. I can't tell you what it was exactly about this scene that captivated me so much, but perhaps the answer lies not in the scene itself, but what it represented. The mid-2000s were an interesting year for video games.
She may not have the stripper physique of other gaming gals, but Alex is confident, tech smart, and knows how to use a shotgun.
We love that guy, the 18 to 34-year-old male. He's the backbone of the industry. And with guys like Dead or Alive 4, he's guaranteed to get the incredible gaming experience that he craves.
Right here. November the 9th. The moment Xbox Nation's been waiting for.
The allure of Shadow of the Colossus wasn't exactly about what it was, so much as what it wasn't. In this onslaught of obnoxious blockbusters, and with indie games far from being widely available, Shadow of the Colossus was a rare and precious thing. Everything was screaming more, and it was proudly declaring less. Its interplay of light and shadow obscured, withholding from the player. It was still spectacular with its incredible scale, but its world was also sparse, desolate, quiet. A friend of mine who had a PS2 got a copy of the game and were so impressed by it, so eager to share, they loaned me their console so I could experience it for myself. Thanks, Daniel. I couldn't believe this was going to be the future of games. When I finished Shadow of the Colossus back in 2006, I was waiting for the next game to come along and raise the bar of what the medium could be. I waited. And waited. No game ever came along at this scale with this capacity for emotional nuance. Well, except Team Ico's own and final game, The Last Guardian. It challenged other games not only in their bombastic executions, but in their power fantasy narratives. A commonly agreed truth about the game is its final twist, a reveal that the player character Wander is the villain of the story. That his quest to resurrect someone dear by slaying giant monsters is actually selfish and destructive. A powerful reframing of violences often romanticised as heroic, but I think that might be a wee bit reductive. Many games with similar twists have faded in the collective memory, had their legacies re-evaluated. Shadow of the Colossus endures as a timeless classic. Is it because of its many other qualities? Undoubtedly. Is it because it does this twist better than those games? Perhaps. Or is it because that's not actually the twist? What if Wander is not the villain of Shadow of the Colossus? Oh, for the purposes of this video, I'll be using Bluepoint's remake for footage. While I will say that it is by no means a substitute for the original, it is a spectacular and faithful remake, where if anyone were to have their first experience of the game be via the remake, I consider them having had much the same experience as I had. Which is to say that while the two versions are undeniably distinct, they overlap in all the ways that matter to the experience and story. The story begins with our protagonist Wander, travelling to a distant land with the body of a dead young woman, Mono. It's a beautiful start, establishing right away the lengths Wander is prepared to go to in his quest. Our first look at the Forbidden Lands where the story takes place is majestic, almost surreal, with an impossibly long and slender bridge its sole connection to the outside world. This location already takes on a mythic status, even before its formal introduction. At the other end of the bridge awaits the Shrine of Worship, a seemingly abandoned temple, opening on its own accord in a manner that is foreboding, to say the least. Within what is an initially gloomy ruin, gives way to an altar of light. There Wander places the body of Mono, and then we are treated to our first piece of exposition. This narration is given by the character Emon, someone who will appear again much later, but he outlines the essentials. In this place there is a being who can resurrect the dead, but it is strictly forbidden to go there. You can imagine this legend, depicted with Emon's mask speaking over a campfire, is the very thing spoken to Wander that led him here. As with all information we receive, it comes from a specific character's perspective. There is no canonical or factual explanation for anything. Everything we don't see, and plenty of what we do, is subject to scrutiny. As Wander puts Mono's body down, shadowy figures emerge from the temple floor, but upon Wander drawing his sword, clearly magical, they are vanquished, and from above a voice emerges, seemingly drawn by the blade. This is Dormin, the entity of legend whose aid Wander wishes to court. Dormin tells him it is indeed possible, thanks to the sword he carries, to bring back the dead, and agrees to do so if Wander can destroy the 16 idols that line the walls by slaying their personifications, the Colossi, out in the world. The boy is warned of a heavy price if he pursues this quest, but Wander agrees without hesitation. From there, the game follows a simple structure, with the player venturing out into the Forbidden Lands to first locate and then slay a Colossus, before returning to the shrine to receive instructions about their next foe. Sounds simple enough, right? The first Colossus is one of the game's most straightforward, but it is the template that defines the others. You set out following the place where the light from your sword gathers. Once there, you must find a way to climb atop the Colossus, find its weak spot, and kill it. Each Colossus is a puzzle, with the real challenge simply knowing how to trick or weaken your foe by attacking its vulnerabilities, so you can climb onto it and reach the magical sigils that represent its weak points. Though even once there, the game maintains a great deal of friction, with its climbing mechanic defined by a limited stamina pool and Wander's quite human limitations. As you climb, the Colossi will shake and thrash, throwing Wander about and eventually off if you run out of stamina. As an avid climber who goes bouldering multiple times a week, I might have predisposed affection to the execution of this particular mechanic. I forget when replaying the game, knowing intimately how to defeat each Colossus, how obscure the solutions sometimes are. The gulf between new and veteran players is measured in huge differences in playtime. While they might be just puzzles in the abstract, in front of you is a huge living, breathing creature, which fights back and attacks as you approach. Probe and struggle long enough, and Dormin will speak to offer a clue on how to defeat the Colossus, but even those can be obscure. There is an undeniable thrill in this David and Goliath dynamic. Colossi have all the strength, all the power, and all the size. You only have your wits to beat them. It's entertaining for the player, but it also makes us root for Wander, seeing him as an underdog tasked with an impossible quest. While each of the first 4 Colossi are unique in their puzzles, they all share a similar format. At ground level they are imposing, perhaps even terrifying. The first can swat at you with a huge club, while the third wields a sword the size of a tower. Number 2 is one of many Colossi with really potent vulnerabilities, the underside of its exposed hooves being struck by arrows, causing it to fall. Yet number 4 has no such vulnerability from the ground, offering a more imposing challenge with its dagger-like legs and exposed skeletal underbelly. This shifting dynamic of vulnerability and formidability is what makes Shadow Colossus a fascinating adventure. What becomes apparent as you fight them is that you are inflicting pain. For all the otherworldliness of their bodies, of earth and fur, bits of building forming armour and anatomy, they try to shake you off like we humans might were we to find a spider on our shoulder. They wail and wince as you inflict your blows upon them, and their fearsome nature often dissolves a little once you reach their weak spots, typically on their head, where the camera frames you plunging your sword while their almost silly faces come into the foreground. Their big round eyes are simple, helpless, childlike and devoid of malice, and early on with limited stamina. Killing them isn't done with a single blow, but repeated stabs at their weak spot, resulting in cries of pain. Shadow of the Colossus isn't the only game where your foes suffer. A notable comparison is the Monster Hunter series, where large beasts similarly cry out and suffer at your hands as you try to best them, chopping off their tails and breaking their bones. While it leads to a strange dissonance in that game, with its cartoonish sensibilities sometimes clashing with the simulated suffering of your quarry, in Shadow of the Colossus is clearly a pointed challenge of the player's theoretical heroism in overcoming these enormous foes. After all, when you finally defeat them, you're not greeted with a stirring champion's fanfare, but this sorrowful lament. I feel obliged to say that many a game is operating under the assumption that you, the player, are responsible for your character's actions, and therefore may try to guilt the audience. It's a largely false assumption. Players can no doubt feel guilt, but we might feel it on behalf of our avatars. Even as we regret their actions, we are driven to act out their stories by curiosity or emotional investment. The medium's degree of interaction changes the way it works, but it doesn't make it active and other mediums passive. All art is active. We are engaged in numerous ways. A thriller may ask us to unravel its story in our head as we watch. You might be watching Dune trying to devise the layered motivations of its cast. This is an active relationship with art, and it's naive to assume that pushing a button to make a character swing a sword automatically involves the audience more. You are no more responsible for the murders your avatar commits than you are for enjoying the banquet of violence in a John Wick film. Now, Shadow of the Colossus understands this. It makes no illusions about choice, trying to pretend that Wander's actions rest at the feet of the player. His quest is linear. We are participants, our involvement heightening the action and exploration, but merely playing out a predetermined story. In fact, that inability to alter the outcome is a key component in a tragedy. If it was possible to simply walk away or work towards a good ending, we'd be able to sidestep all the murky moral questions about Wander's quest. So when you hear that mournful music, it's not about making you feel bad about the thing you just did. The game made those battles exciting. The potential cruelty of Wander's actions isn't presented as a dramatic rug pull, but instead a lingering question. The now legendary score by Koho Atani deserves special mention for adding to the game's emotional complexity, layering its pivotal moments with conflicting moods. Even its action-packed themes are tinged with awe and sadness, while the sad music played at each victory ultimately gives way to something peaceful. Because if tragedy was all Shadow of the Colossus had to offer, it would have no need for 16 Colossi. Instead, each one feels like a variation on a theme, remixing the emotional journey of the battles. Initially, the variations are small, inclusions of surprising vulnerability. The fifth Colossus marks a significant turning point in these variations. As if marking this itself, the game has a unique cutscene when returning to the shrine after defeating the fourth Colossus, in which Wander approaches Mono, whether it's hoping for a glimpse of life or to rekindle his resolve. This fifth Colossus is a departure from those before it, even at a glance. It's airborne, a massive flying beast. The other thing that sets it apart is that unlike the previous four, it won't attack when approached. Instead, it perches on the towers above the water and simply watches. In silence, its eyes follow Wander wherever the player takes them. In judgment, curiosity, anticipation. This time, to engage in a fight, you have to provoke it, firing at it with your bow. If all the Colossi are asking us to interrogate Wander's quest, this marks a tipping point where it's impossible to say Wander acted in anything approaching self-defense. Previously, you might argue that these creatures are clearly aggressive. Malicious, maybe. You cannot say the same here. In this instance, Wander is explicitly the aggressor. Yet unlike the previous ones, the fifth does not feel especially vulnerable once mounted, as the rush of air and flap of its wings can easily send you hurtling back below. Nor is there a close-up of an unassuming face. This fight starts menacing and ends exhilarating, putting the moment of doubt in the middle of its arc. The Colossi might be the game's centerpiece, but a huge chunk of time will be spent roaming the Forbidden Lands, an isolated kingdom that was clearly once inhabited, but is now entirely devoid of people. Even by today's standards of dauntingly vast open worlds, the Forbidden Lands still feel huge. Part of this is a sense of scale. So many of its structures and valleys tower over wonder, while the camera carefully frames him as minuscule. That sense of vastness is important to the game's core mood. Loneliness. There are no side quests and scarcely any explicit secrets. Nowhere will you find audio logs or a hidden diary to fill in the backstory. This world exists for its own sake, as a meditative space. Its lack of answers creates a vacuum of speculation that can never be filled. There are no definitive conclusions, a big reason why fans believed for years that there was still something hidden in the original game. A big reason for the game's distinct feel was what director Fumito Ueda called subtractive design. This was a process by which they tried to remove as many elements as possible, to keep nothing that wasn't essential. The games of Team Ico are anti-artifice. Everything, from the painstaking animation to the carefully naturalistic setting, is there to put its world first and foremost. There's little about it that feels gamey, a term I use to describe that feeling of artifice, when a game is exposed as a blatant collection of systems. You know, a measure of unlockable items or experience pop-ups. These aren't inherently bad, but presenting the artifice of the game's framework to players makes it harder to buy into the reality of its story and characters. Wonder's journey is remarkably vivid, even all these years on, because it's so singular in its focus. When you play Shadow of the Colossus, the time between fights and its absence of additional content mean there's nothing to do but let your mind wander. Who built this place? What happened to them? Now, while there are no definitive answers, like I said, the game wouldn't intrigue if there was no discernible information at all. In fact, the Forbidden Lands contains a host of hints and possibilities. At the heart of everything is a shrine of worship, and while we might assume that Dormin's presence there suggests it was their temple, we can't truly know. The idols that line its walls represent the Colossi, beings whose existence, we learn later, keep Dormin imprisoned. Did they perhaps worship Dormin's power rather than the entity itself? As the game progresses, more and more of these colossi are housed in huge structures, locations integral to their battles, intertwining your struggles with the ruins of those who came before you. Cities and colosseums, dams and barrows. Their society is evident, but it's unclear whether these places were built with the colossi in mind, or these golems came sometime after. To me, the place is reminiscent of Studio Ghibli works like Laputa Castle in the Sky, an influence felt in Ico and The Last Guardian too. Obscure influences like the work of artist Gerard Trignac manifest in its complex, overlapping architecture. But perhaps the most prominent cornerstones are Mayan and Incan cultures, manifested in the ruins littered throughout. This is complemented by a debt to the cultures of northern Japan's indigenous people that I knew, something was clearly felt in Wonder's attire. This mixture of influences makes for an end result which feels like its own, distinct and unique to its mythical landscape. The Forbidden Lands is tranquil, but I also find an eeriness to it at times, contemplating what happened to its occupants. Whatever power they wielded didn't protect them. Without any exposition, the notion of what this place and its people were lingers more as a feeling than anything concrete. Whether they were driven out, vanished, or fled doesn't really matter. They're gone. Who they were isn't important. What they left behind is. And so too are you left to contemplate what Wonder is leaving behind. As his quest continues, the land is littered with the graves of his foes, marked by beams of light ascending to the heaven. Once magnificent things laid low, to be forgotten and left for distant, future travellers to speculate about. For all the profound isolation found in Shadow of the Colossus, you do not roam its empty landscapes alone. Always by Wonder's side is their trusty steed, Agro. Despite her spoken lines being only neighing, she's one of its few characters and arguably the most prominent after Wonder. She's also one of the game's most contentious points amongst critics. Where most games plonk you on a horse like it's a car with legs instead of wheels, Agro is driven by AI, and responds to player inputs more as suggestions than as direct commands. Players often find themselves wrestling with her reins, spamming the spurs to urge her forward. Of course, this friction is both key to the bond players will develop with them, and often misunderstood. Agro is perfectly capable of steering herself, and should players simply let her gallop in the general direction they need to go, they'll often find her navigating just fine. Like any relationship, it's all about trust, and players who keep trying to take control will indeed find themselves at odds with Agro. And doesn't she deserve your trust, you heartless bitches? Agro is loyal, always rushing to the aid of their rider. Whenever you fall or return to the shrine, Agro comes running, and a chunk of the game features Colossi dependent on you riding Agro to defeat them, a test of your bond and trust in one another that involves tackling some of the game's most aggressive foes. If you've been treating Agro like a taxi this whole time, these fights will probably put you on your arse. This AI and player relationship is a concept that's an evolution of the one in Eco, and would receive greater exploration in The Last Guardian's fraught relationship with Griffin-like Trico. But Shadow Colossus still uses Agro's presence to full effect. More than your only companion, she is Wander's tether to his own humanity. Agro is innocent and heroic, qualities that make Wander's quest seem more noble. Her presence makes Wander kinder and more likeable. As players, we cling to this connection and imbue this simple relationship with so much friendship. The modicum of friction simply makes Agro feel like a distinct individual, and makes the moments where they're there for Wander all the more impactful. And even though he seems ready to throw himself through whatever suffering awaits on his doomed quest, his pain clearly causes Agro distress. It makes their loyalty more like when you're standing by a friend that you really wish would treat themselves a lot better. Agro is the heart of Shadow of the Colossus, and Wander would have never succeeded without her. The game's other major character is far less simple. The entity Dormin is enigmatic in the extreme, nothing more than a disembodied voice for most of the game's story, guiding Wander on their quest with hints and clues. Their presence is often accompanied by ominous or foreboding music, suggesting a great and dark power to them. I mean, they wield the ability to bring back the dead, something they themselves admit goes against human laws and beliefs. Engaging in this ritual is at the very least a massive taboo. They're not called the Forbidden Lands for nothing. Trying to divine Dormin's ultimate motives is impossible, since we never see how things would have played out without the intervention of Amon. All we have to go on is in what they say and the way their presence is manifested, because always there is a duality to Dormin. They speak with both a masculine and feminine voice at the same time, referring to themselves only ever as we. Genderqueer, non-binary icon. In the temple where they speak to Wander, there are two ceiling openings, the one from which their voice emanates and another, darker and neglected. They manifest as shadows, but their spoken presence emerges from light. And around this temple and the Forbidden Lands itself is both a great desolation and a lush, untouched wilderness. Dormin is initially framed as a dark god, an evil master of death, but the entity we meet is much more complex. If Dormin seems to be a god of anything, it's balance. The very ritual they have Wander perform is ultimately an exchange. For every shadow that appears around Wander following a Colossus slain, a dove gathers around Mono. A life for a life. Dormin's name has many allusions, but perhaps the most obvious is that it's Nimrod backwards. Nimrod is a biblical figure from the Book of Genesis and the Book of Chronicles, often said to have ordered the construction of the Tower of Babel, but there are numerous versions of him in his story. Nimrod was said to have been dismembered and his body parts taken to the corners of the earth, not unlike the nature of Dormin's imprisonment. But Nimrod was also said to be someone who sought to rival and replace God, to become a deity and be worshipped. Is it possible that Dormin too was once mortal? Or was it the people who imprisoned them that wanted to replace them? If the Colossi are golems given life to house a portion of Dormin's power, then it's interesting to me that they are depicted as beings of not just of earth and fur like moss, but bits of architecture, as if they were old temples imbued with life. It's interesting because Dormin strikes me as an entity of balance, of nature even, and his guards, so to speak, represent man-made artifice, structure and architecture placed over the natural. The Colossi we fight in this later stage of the game are some of the most architectural and constructed yet, culminating with the 12th, a Colossus that seems to be the only one without visible eyes, and whose head is a massive crown, the ultimate embodiment of human aspiration to rule. It's also the only Colossus we can control, hitting the crown of teeth-like objects to command it in a given direction. The fact it's housed away in a dam, the simplest expression of dominion over nature, makes it an all too neat package. So what if Dormin isn't evil, but nature and balance, a being destined to keep harmony? Such an entity would be at odds with a humanity who wished to spread across the world to construct and control nature and escape its confines. But if Dormin is a god of nature, of balance, then what are they bringing balance to in this story? When Wonder arrives in the Forbidden Lands, he says precious little of the girl whose body he's brought with him. We don't know anything about their relationship. Lovers, friends, siblings, strangers. We know nothing. That ambiguity in their relationship allows us instead to focus on Wonder's emotional state, his near blinding focus and determination. Yet, he does say one thing. She was sacrificed because she had a cursed fate. Now, I don't know about you, but being sacrificed because you had a cursed fate sounds like a load of absolute shite. Murdered because of a supposed destiny? Who can possibly make such a claim, and who can decide the solution? The penalty for this is death. The implication is that it was Eamon, the shaman who inadvertently led Wonder here with their stories, and who seems very knowledgeable about Dormin, the sword, and the Forbidden Lands itself. A murder performed under religious superstition then, one which may well be an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy, since it is this murderous act that sets the entire story's events in motion. Wonder is often framed as a tragic hero at best, a lamentable villain at worst. He comes to a strange land and lays waste to magnificent creatures, with seemingly little regard for his actions. With each Colossus battle, we're invited to contemplate the relationship between Wonder and his violence, which shifts between encounters that feel brave and those which feel cruel. The 13th Colossus is a fan favourite, and it's not hard to see why. The biggest and most spectacular, this huge flying serpent is a landscape unto itself, and exists on a scale that even years later is still a technical marvel. 13 is the only Colossus that is truly, completely and utterly benevolent. It not only doesn't attack you, but cannot. While Wonder can be injured falling from its back, they have no offensive moves, no way to defend itself. Killing it can feel crueler than any other Colossus in the game. The remaining Colossus occupy the greatest extremes, being both the most aggressive and dangerous of all, while succumbing to fear and terror. The 11th is one of the game's smallest Colossi, but incredibly agile and deadly. It is defeated by fire, which it cowers in fear of, the player tricking them to retreat off a cliff as they attempt to escape the flame. While there remains a David and Goliath feel to these battles, with Wonder using smarts and tricks to defeat opponents by which he is outmatched, there's equally something cruel about exploiting the fears and vulnerabilities. Not all the Colossi are so sympathetic. 15 defends a city and even wields a sword. With several stages to their defeat, they represent one of the toughest enemies in the game. It's aggressive and powerful, its vulnerability is small and well protected. Like these shifting battles, Wonder is also a hero of contradictions. He does these things for his own ends, to resolve his own grief, but it's also to save someone else's life, something he's willing to do at the cost of his own. People have rightly asserted his mission as selfish, but it's incredibly selfless too. I would argue that Wonder's quest isn't tragic simply because of his fate, or because of his questionable actions and violence, but because to me it's so clearly a quest born from the pursuit of justice. Mono's murder is inexcusable. Wonder is breaking the law of his people, but to correct an injustice born of that law. If the agreement of society led to the death of this young woman, of what worth is it? Wonder's mission reflects many classic legends in the princess and dragon archetype, whether they be Perseus rescuing Andromeda from the monster Cetus, or the tale of St. George and the dragon. Of course, Wonder's quest isn't so simple. The maiden in question is already dead. His act of rescue isn't so neatly heroic by the standards of his society, and he has to step outside of it to complete his mission, literally and figuratively. It's of note then that this archetypal tale has been framed by the likes of famed writer Joseph Campbell, author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces and coiner of the term monomyth, a figure and body of work which is by no means gospel or without huge issues, as being about the hero's renewal of humans' relationship with nature, something that is the focus of the recent adaptation of The Green Knight. In slaying their monsters and dragons, they also partake of their blood, and in doing so, re-establish the connection severed. With each Colossus slain, Wonder takes on the essence of Dormin. By releasing Dormin, is Wonder restoring balance to the world. The culmination of his quest comes as the game picks up momentum. We know Amon is on their way with soldiers in tow, and Dormin warns Wonder of their imminent arrival, urging them to complete the ritual before it's too late. The last foe in his way lies to the far south, behind a magically sealed gate and housed deep within a massive coastal ruin. To reach this final foe, though, isn't without cost. A collapsing bridge causes Agro to sacrifice herself to save Wonder, the horse plunging into the water below. I'm not crying, you're crying. With his companion gone, Wonder's connection to his own innocence is severed. Rain begins to fall and a menacing, foreboding theme eventually follows as we see the final Colossus. "16 is a unique Colossus, towering but rooted to the spot. The fact they can't move only makes them more ominous, as if they've simply been here, waiting for you like it's all inevitable. More than any other Colossus, they are the game's most human and most architectural, as much structure as man. They attack Wonder from afar with explosive projectiles, forcing him to take cover and navigate around to get close. They're also one of the most linear and complicated enemies in the game, requiring a specific sequence of actions to reach the vulnerable spot in their head. Getting there involves these small curious pauses from the Colossus, as it holds Wonder up for inspection, a moment Wonder must exploit by striking at its vulnerabilities. From a distance, the final Colossus is deadly and frankly downright evil looking, but up close they are curious. The music initially elevated this final foe's menace, but as Wonder approaches its weak spot, taking advantage of its hesitation and nears the culmination of the ritual, it becomes his theme, a violent act from which there is no return, no escaping what is to follow. But in defeating them, perhaps too, is the destruction of something more. This final Colossus, the most human of them all, embodies humankind as a tower not unlike the one of Babel. With a final blow, it is done. The Colossus collapses under its own weight. Wonder's quest is complete. Amon arrives at the Shrine of Worship just in time to witness the final idol's destruction, where we finally learn how Wonder was getting back to the shrine after each kill. Spoilers, he took a flight on Dormin Airways. With the ritual complete, Wonder is left fully transformed, with horns growing from his head and his eyes resembling those of the many colossi he has slain. Amon is outraged, and from him we learn that Wonder stole the sword in secret. He also tells Wonder that they were only being used. Without hesitation and showcasing an impulse to violence that might explain Mono's death, he orders Wonder's execution. Eradicate the source of the evil, he commands. Our protagonist is then slain, much like the colossi before him, made vulnerable with an initial strike before a sword is plunged into him. Yet Wonder, their determination still unwavering, stands and reaches for Mono with black blood spilling out of him, in the same fashion as the colossi. He pulls out the sword, collapses, and is consumed by shadow. And from him a manifestation of Dormin emerges, accusing Amon, personally or the order he represents, of severing their body into 16 parts to seal away their power. A small detail here, but Dormin still refers to themselves exclusively as we, but immediately Amon is out here like he's been resurrected, and it's a perfect example to me of Amon representing a society that imposes its norms on others. Now, I'm not saying Shadow Colossus has a villain, but if it did... Another important detail is Dormin claims to be borrowing Wonder's body. Whether you take them at their word or not is an interesting distinction. What would have happened if Amon hadn't shown up? Would Dormin have manifested in another way? Players briefly control this manifestation in a futile attempt to stop Amon and his soldiers from escaping, to cast a seal over the shrine, one of them grabbing the stolen sword on their way. It's our turn to see things from the perspective of the Colossi, helpless as these little beings scurry around us. Then Amon uses the sword to cast his seal, creating a light that draws in Dormin and Wonder. One last time we hear the funereal music as we're given control, allowed to resist the pull of the light for as long as our stamina lasts. Again, it's futile. Wonder's fate is sealed. They let go. They are ended. Or perhaps not. Amon and his soldiers flee the Forbidden Lands, that impossible bridge collapsing behind them and cutting the kingdom off from the outside world. Back in the Shrine of Worship, Mono awakens, just as Dormin promised. Resurrection guaranteed. She's not alone either. Agro survived. Over the credits, we get a look at the graves of the slain Colossi, a reminder of what Wonder has left in their wake. And while there's a sadness, it gives way to hope, as each Colossus has in turn given their way to more life, plants and trees sprouting from their corpses. And even as Amon decries Wonder as a poor, ungodly soul, we soon learn that Wonder may yet live, reborn in some form. Amon might not think anything can live here, but Agro shows Mono to the upper, unseen part of the shrine, where a sanctuary full of life awaits. Animals gathering around the newborn, promising that they will be able to thrive here in this God-forsaken place. There is tragedy laced throughout Shadow of the Colossus, but the end is not about loss, but about rebirth and renewal, out with the old, in with the new. If the Colossi represent humanity's dominion, its infrastructure to shackle nature, then maybe Wonder's actions are about more than destruction. His quest is a rebuke against the structures and ideas that facilitated the injustice he sought to correct. Mono's death was at the hands of those who thought they knew best, who thought they could seal away something primordial and never suffer any consequences. The Colossi are by turns sympathetic creatures, but it wasn't Dormin who created them or placed them in harm's way. His captors created these beings as living shields, formidable warriors to keep away any would-be rescuers. Wonder didn't know he was releasing Dormin, but his singular focus suggests he would have fulfilled this quest anyway. As Freud wrote in The Future of an Illusion, a civilization which leaves so large a number of its participants unsatisfied and drives them into revolt neither has nor deserves the prospect of a lasting existence. I'd take my chances with Dormin too. They did what they promised they would. While Amon curses Wonder's actions, we don't see exactly what it is that's supposed to make Dormin so evil. We only see them fight in self-defense, only see them have Wonder kill their prison guards, and ultimately use their power to undo a wrongful killing. By contrast, Amon and his followers are killers and remorseless as they slay Wonder. They wear masks, a suggestion that these people have something to hide, that they're not who they say they are. Wonder's mission is not without bloodshed. The game is constantly asking us to feel for those majestic creatures that are to be slain, but we can mourn the means while being grateful for the end. He fought to undo a terrible thing and throws himself again and again and again and again and again against these giants. He's willing to throw his own life away because he believes what's right matters more. If Shadow of the Colossus was a parable about the futility of grief, of the impossibility of trying to change the world and right a wrong, it could have easily ended with a ritual of failure and Wonder dead. It doesn't. This destruction doesn't lead to doom. There is a future full of life and peace. The song that plays over this scene is literally called Hope. The price you pay may be heavy indeed, but some things are worth it. Hey, thanks for watching, and thank you so much to all my patrons whose support made this video possible. If you enjoy my work and would like to support me, see your name listed here and get access to exclusive stuff, then please join my Patreon, which is linked in the description. Your support makes all the difference and allows me to do what I do. See y'all next time.